Have you ever seen someone on the subway who didn't seem real? It was close to midnight, and I was heading home after a late shift. The platform was nearly empty, except for a lone man sitting at the far end. He wore an old-fashioned suit, his face hidden under the brim of a dusty bowler hat. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I told myself I was just tired. When the train finally arrived, it screeched to a halt with an ear-piercing grind. I stepped inside, and to my unease, realized the car was completely empty, except for him. He sat near the middle, staring out the window, though we were underground. But then, as I took my seat, I noticed something odd. The windows weren't reflecting him. They showed me the flickering lights, the worn-down seats, but not him. My chest tightened, and I tried not to look in his direction. The train started moving, faster than usual, the lights outside the window blending into a surreal streak. The man began to hum, a low, tuneless sound that didn't match the vibrations of the train. It crawled into my ears like nails on a chalkboard. I pulled out my phone, trying to distract myself, but there was no signal. The clock on my screen froze at 11:59. But then, the train slowed, and I glanced out the window. We weren't at any station I recognized. It was a cavernous space, dimly lit by swaying bulbs. The walls were covered in graffiti that looked ancient, symbols and faces scrawled in a language I didn't understand. The man stood up, his movements jerky, like a puppet on tangled strings. His hat tipped backward, and I finally saw his face. Or what should have been a face. There was nothing there, just a smooth, blank surface, like skin stretched over a mannequin. Panic surged through me as he turned toward me, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. I stumbled to my feet, slamming the emergency stop button, but the train didn't slow down. He began to walk, his footsteps echoing louder than they should in the empty car. I bolted toward the next car, but the door wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but the man was right behind me now. His blank face seemed to ripple, as though something inside was pressing against the skin. But then, the train jerked violently, throwing me to the floor. The lights flickered and went out. I braced for his touch, for whatever nightmare he would bring. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the platform where I'd started. The clock read 12:01. My heart raced as I looked around, expecting to see him, but there was no sign of the train, the man, or even the graffiti-covered station. I never took the subway at night again, but sometimes, when I walk by the station, I swear I can hear that humming, low and tuneless, rising up from somewhere deep below. What would you do if the subway started whispering your name? I was on a downtown train, half asleep when I first heard it, faint and fleeting like a breath caught in the screech of the brakes. Michael, my name. I jolted awake, looking around the crowded car. Nobody seemed to notice, just commuters, heads buried in their phones, the usual mix of exhaustion and indifference. I told myself it was my imagination, the wind in the tunnel, and went back to staring at my reflection in the grimy window. But then, as the train plunged deeper into the underground, the voice came again, louder this time. "Michael, help me!" My skin crawled. The lights in the car flickered and the train began to slow, though we weren't near a station. When it stopped completely, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a delay due to an obstruction on the track. That's when I saw her. She was standing just outside the window in the darkness of the tunnel, her pale face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and unblinking. A woman in a tattered gray dress, her hair matted with dirt, staring straight at me. I froze. She mouthed something, her lips moving soundlessly. Then the lights flickered again and she was gone. But then I felt it, a hand brushing against my arm. I turned sharply, but no one was there. The commuters seemed oblivious, as though they couldn't feel the icy chill creeping through the car. The voice came again, louder now, echoing through the tunnel. "Michael, you left me." Memories I had buried long ago surged forward. A drunken night, a dare to explore the abandoned sections of the subway, the girl who had been with me, Anna. I hadn't seen her in years, hadn't thought about her since that night. The train jolted violently, and the lights cut out completely. In the pitch black, I could hear them, whispers rising from all around. Not just Anna, but others, dozens of voices, wailing, crying, accusing. "You left us?" I bolted for the emergency exit at the end of the car, prying the door open with shaking hands. The tunnel stretched endlessly in either direction, the air heavy with the stench of rot. But then, I saw her again, standing in the center of the tracks, her arms outstretched. Her face was no longer human, her mouth stretched impossibly wide, her eyes black pits. "Stay with me," she whispered. The train roared to life behind me, its headlights illuminating her horrific form. I scrambled onto the platform just as it barreled through, missing me by inches. When I looked back, she was gone, but I could still hear the whispers, trailing me as I climbed the stairs to the street. I haven't been back to the subway since, but every night I hear the same voice in my dreams. "Michael, you left me." Have you ever felt like someone was watching you in an empty subway car? It was late, the kind of late where the city feels dead, and the only people out are those who can't afford to be home yet. I was the last passenger on the train, or so I thought. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed in my ears, and the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks threatened to lull me to sleep. But then, I noticed the shadows didn't match. I was sitting near the middle of the car, yet there was a long, looming shadow stretching across the floor in front of me. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see someone standing in the aisle. There was no one there. "Next stop, Terminal 13, crackled the intercom. Terminal 13? That wasn't on the line. I checked the route map plastered above the window. There was no Terminal 13. I glanced outside, but the train had plunged into pitch darkness. No lights, no graffiti-streaked walls, just an endless void. Then the doors at the far end of the car hissed open. A man stepped in. He was dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his navy coat immaculate, brass buttons gleaming faintly in the dim light. His hat sat low, shadowing his face, but I could see his smile, too wide, too sharp. "Tickets, please," he drawled, his voice low and metallic, like a broken music box. I don't have a ticket," I stammered. "My Metro card was in my pocket, but I wasn't about to argue." He tilted his head, that smile never wavering. "No ticket? Well, that won't do. You see, only those with tickets can leave." The train jolted and I realized we weren't slowing down. If anything, we were speeding up. The windows began to rattle and outside strange shapes swirled in the darkness, fleeting, impossible forms. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The conductor's laughter echoed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You can't leave until your stop," he said, stepping closer. "And your stop is Terminal 13. But then, I looked back at him, and his face had changed. Or rather, it was gone. Where his features had been, there was now only a hollow void, black and endless, pulling at me like a whirlpool. I screamed as the train lurched violently, throwing me against the wall. The lights flickered, and suddenly I was back. The car was empty, the hum of the city's night train the only sound. I stumbled off at the next station, the name of which I didn't even recognize, but as I climbed the stairs to the surface, I saw it, an old, rusted sign. Terminal 13, closed since 1926. I don't take the subway anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint echo of a hollow voice, whispering, "Tickets, please." If you're still watching and enjoying these chilling tales, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more haunting stories like these. Let us know in the comments. Would you dare ride the subway alone after midnight? Have you ever heard a voice that seemed to come from the ground beneath you? It started as a normal ride home, the subway rumbling under the weight of tired commuters. By the time the train reached my stop, I was the only one left. I stepped off onto the platform, where a damp chill hung in the air. As I walked toward the stairs, a strange sound caught my ear. At first, I thought it was just static from the overhead speakers. But then, I realized it was whispering. It came from the tracks. Curiosity overruled caution, and I leaned over to look. The third rail, that infamous conductor of deadly electricity, seemed to shimmer faintly. The whispers grew louder, almost like voices arguing over who should speak next. But then, it spoke to me directly. "Come closer," the voice hissed, soft but insistent. My heart raced. Logic told me to leave, but I found myself frozen, staring at the rail. It began to glow faintly, a sickly green light pulsating along its length. "Closer," the voice repeated, almost soothing now. My foot moved on its own, edging toward the platform's edge. A chill crept up my spine as I realized I couldn't stop myself. But then, I saw them. Faces. Dozens of faces reflected in the steel rail, distorted and anguished, mouths open in silent screams. "Help us," they pleaded. I staggered backward, but the voices surged, louder and more desperate. "Don't leave us here!" My breath caught as the glow from the third rail intensified, casting long, warped shadows across the platform. The air felt heavy, electric, as though the entire station was alive and breathing. Then, from the tunnel, a figure emerged. It was hunched, its body made of shifting darkness, its limbs stretching unnaturally. It pointed at me, its voice a guttural rasp. "You've heard them. Now you must join them." I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. The whispers followed me, growing angrier. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching toward me like grasping hands. I didn't stop until I burst into the open air, gasping for breath. I haven't gone near a subway station since. But every now and then, when I walk past a grate or hear the faint hum of the trains below, I swear I hear those whispers again. "Help us," or "Join us." Have you ever felt like the subway was hiding someone in plain sight? It was late, and I was riding the subway alone. The train rocked gently as it sped through the tunnels, the lights flickering sporadically. I stared at the scrolling ads above the seats, trying to keep myself awake. But then, I saw her. She was standing outside the train, between the cars, in that narrow, forbidden space. Her pale face pressed against the glass of the door, her long, black hair dripping wet. as though she'd just stepped out of a river. And I froze, my mind scrambling for logic. No one was supposed to be there. No one could stand there without falling to their death. And yet, there she was, staring directly at me. The train rattled violently as we rounded a corner, but she didn't move. Her unblinking eyes bore into mine, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. But then, her hand rose, pressing against the glass. I could see the marks her wet fingers left behind. She tilted her head slowly, as if beckoning me to come closer. I couldn't look away. Something about her gaze rooted me to the spot. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and I finally broke free of her spell. I bolted to the platform, my heart pounding. The doors opened, but the space between the cars was empty. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. As the train pulled away, I saw her again, this time standing in the reflection of the opposite window, though no one else had boarded. The whispers started then, faint but unmistakable. "You left me." I staggered back, almost falling onto the platform. She hadn't just been staring at me. She'd been watching me, waiting. But then, I realized I'd seen her before. Years ago, on a drunken night with friends, we dared each other to jump between train cars. She'd been there with us, laughing, until she slipped. The screams, the screech of the brakes, they all came rushing back. I turned to run up the stairs, but the air around me grew heavy, suffocating. The lights flickered, and her voice was everywhere. "You left me there, now it's your turn." The world tilted as I felt something cold wrap around my wrist. I glanced back, and her face was inches from mine, her lips twisted into a grotesque grin. Her eyes were wide, and they looked at me with hatred and horror. I woke up on the platform hours later, the first train of the morning pulling in. I don't know if it was a nightmare or if she was real, but every time I hear the screech of metal on metal, I feel her eyes watching, waiting for me to step between the cars again. Have you ever noticed someone on the subway who seemed out of place? It was just another late-night commute, the train nearly empty except for me and a handful of tired faces. I sat by the door, staring at my reflection in the window as we raced through the dark tunnels. But then I saw him. He was sitting at the far end of the car, dressed in a tattered gray suit, his head tilted downward so I couldn't see his face. I hadn't noticed him bored. He sat completely still, like a statue, as the train rocked back and forth. I tried to ignore him, but something about his presence made my skin crawl. The air in the car felt colder than usual, and the rhythmic hum of the train sounded off, like a faint voice weaving through the vibrations. At the next station, the doors hissed open. A young couple got on, laughing softly as they found seats near the middle. The man in the suit didn't move, didn't even lift his head. The woman in the suit got into the seat, but then the couple stopped laughing. They glanced toward him, their smiles fading, and whispered nervously to each other. I watched as the woman stood up, grabbed her boyfriend's arm, and hurried to the next car. The man in the suit remained motionless. I couldn't take my eyes off him now. The train entered another tunnel, and the lights flickered. For a split second, his reflection in the window wasn't sitting. It was standing, staring back at me. My breath caught. When the light steadied, he was still seated, head down. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then, the train began to slow, though we weren't near a station. I caught sight of an almost fancy-looking person, hiding behind a handrail and watching. The lights dimmed and the intercom crackled with static. A voice came through, distorted and garbled, saying something I couldn't make out. I glanced toward the man, and my heart nearly stopped. He was standing now, His head still bowed, but his body was twisted unnaturally, his limbs bent at angles that shouldn't be possible. His shadow stretched impossibly long, creeping toward me across the floor, loosened limbs poking at the morning-tinted ground with lacerated bones. As I stared at him, I felt a twinge of pain. The train came to a halt in the middle of the tunnel. The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. "Get off," her voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. When the emergency lights flickered on, the man was gone. The train jolted forward, and I stumbled off at the next station, shaking and gasping for air. I told the station worker what I'd seen, expecting them to laugh it off. But then, their face turned pale. Sounds like him," they muttered. "The passenger. People say he's been riding this line for decades, but he never leaves, and neither do the ones who look too long. I don't ride that line anymore. But sometimes, when I'm waiting for a train, I catch a glimpse of him in the reflections of the windows, always sitting at the far end of the car, waiting for someone else to notice." Have you ever heard a sound on the subway that you couldn't explain? It was late, past the point when most sane people had already gone home. I was on the last train, the one that always seemed to stop too long in the middle of nowhere. That night, the delay was longer than usual. The train screeched to a stop between stations, and the lights dimmed to a faint, sickly yellow. Outside the windows was nothing but the dark walls of the tunnel. I sighed, checking my phone. No signal. But then, I heard it. A scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you could dismiss as brakes grinding or a drunk passenger shouting. It was raw, guttural, and filled with pain. It came from somewhere outside the train, deep in the tunnel. I looked around, expecting someone else to react, but the other passengers didn't even flinch. They were staring at their phones or nodding off, oblivious to the sound that was growing louder, closer. The lights flickered, and for a brief second, I saw something outside the window. A figure, hunched and shivering, crawling along the tracks. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The figure stopped crawling and turned its head toward me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a mass of darkness, void-like, with no features except for its gaping mouth. Another scream tore through the air, deafening now, rattling the walls of the train car. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but when I turned to warn the others, they were gone. Every seat was empty. But then, I heard the doors hiss open. The air turned frigid, and I felt a presence step onto the train. I didn't dare turn around. My legs locked in place, and my chest tightened as the screaming started again, softer now, but coming from inside the car. "Don't look," a voice whispered, faint but urgent. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see a reflection in the darkened window. A tall, gaunt figure was standing at the far end of the car, its body contorted, its head twitching violently. The doors hissed shut and the train jolted forward. The figure began to move toward me, its footsteps echoing louder than they should have. I bolted. I ran through the next car and the next, each one just as empty as the last. The train felt endless. The windows darkened, so I couldn't see outside. But then the screaming stopped. I looked back. The figure was gone, but so were the doors, the walls, even the seats. I was standing in a tunnel. The train vanished, the air thick with silence. At the same time, the only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging above a sign, Station 103. There is no Station 103 on the subway map. I eventually found my way out, climbing up into the cold, empty streets. I've never set foot in a subway since, but sometimes, when I walk past a station entrance, I hear the faint echo of that scream, calling me back to the darkness below.